at the center and then radiate outwards. So.
Well, I got in trouble with this a couple weeks ago. I will say this. Everybody, I get all these people on my show, right? Two things they always say. Aliens are, the grays are warm, fuzzy, and lovable. Bigfoot are, send out orbs and they're friendly and lovable. But you have a look at, and here's where I got in trouble. I said, we eat everything. It's beneath us. In fact, we even eat humans on our planet and have. Okay, we eat everything.
Yep.
Okay, now you look at maybe a civilization, just because maybe they're 10,000 years or 50,000 years or whatever advanced than us, we don't know what their mindset is. So they could look at us just as we look at, like at that deer or that cow. They could look at us as food, and people don't realize that.
Well, that's actually the famous argument of that outer limits to serve man.
Yeah.
That the UFOs, they were seers, and they came down, and they cured cancer, and they fixed our electrical systems, and there was world peace. And they left a book, and they slowly were translating the book. And they translated the cover, and it said to serve man. And so finally the guy who was like the protagonist, he didn't trust them, and there was something wrong or whatever. He finally was like, okay, I'll go to your planet. I'm curious. I can't find anything wrong with you guys, so I'm going to go. So he gets in line, and he's standing in line, and the woman that had actually been doing the translation runs out with the book, and she goes, the book to serve man. And he goes, yes. He goes, it's a cookbook. And then he gets forced on the ship.
Yeah. Well, guess what? He was somebody's delight one night in a barbecue. I tell you that.
That's right.
Yeah.
But again, very, very true. And I always get in trouble because I say, and that's if the grays even exist.
Yeah.
We have a perception of the grays, but who knows? Maybe it's false memories that are implanted. It's J. Allen Hynek always said that there were 10% of all UFO sightings that were truly unexplainable. And I buy that. I think they're aliens. I think that they're real. But I don't think they're here to save us. I don't think that they're here to help us. I don't think they're here to do anything other than watch us.
Well, I do think...
When I was a kid, I used to watch Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom with Marlon Perkins. I seem to remember it came on like right after Battlestar Galactica, or I always tied it for some reason to Battlestar Galactica in the late 70s. But I remember watching Marlon Perkins. And I remember he's up in this rickety Hughes helicopter, and he's got this tranquilizer rifle, and they've got there's a bunch of buffalo. And, he's talking, we're going to tag it. And so finally he shoots one of these buffalo, and the buffalo falls down. And they land the helicopter, and Marlon walks out there. There are all these vets and stuff, and they're poking and prodding and taking skin samples and whatever. The last thing they do is that they clip a transponder onto this poor buffalo's ear. And he's explaining, we can follow it around and blah, blah, blah. And I thought to myself, that sounds an awful lot like an alien implant.
Oh, yeah.
I think they're following us. I think that maybe they're anthropologists. I don't know. But I don't think that they're actively trying to help us or anything.
No, but then, how can I say this? I mean, now we go back to like the Finks, okay? They have come to recently a decision that the wear marks on the back of it predates it to man, and said those wear marks were created like from an ocean, not from wind blowing sand. That means it was there before humans. Something created that. And sometimes I wonder if we are...
Well, it wasn't necessarily there before humans. It was there before we thought humans were there.
Yeah, well, maybe we're...
That's a big distinction.
Maybe we're rebooted. And maybe we're a big cattle farm, too. You ever think of that?
I have. But the one I always go back to is the Mahabharata. That in the Mahabharata, it talks about this climactic war between these two brothers, that there was a king, and he had died, and the two brothers were fighting over the kingdom. And at the very end, and this is the whole Vimana thing, there were Vimanas flying through the air, shooting laser beams at everybody. and blowing stuff up, and they had this cataclysmic war. And at the end of the war, the last thing that happened was the one brother fired a weapon at the city of the other brother, right? And it's described as a pillar of fire that hit the earth with all the energy of the sun, okay? And most people have interpreted that to mean that it was a nuclear weapon, okay? But I've always maintained, you still there?
No, I'm here. I'm listening to what you're saying.
Okay. I've always maintained that weapon was actually a kinetic energy weapon. So you know how you were saying that the meteorite hit and had like 2.5 kilotons worth of explosion? Well, a kinetic energy weapon's like that. So basically the way that modern humans designed it was something called Project Thor. And it was called the rods from God. Basically they're telephone pole-sized tungsten rods that are encased in, I forget what the material is, but they're encased in this material, and you fire them from orbit. And when they go through reentry, the outer shell of the tungsten rod turns into plasma. So it would look like a streak of fire. And when it hits the earth, the plasma shell cracks and breaks off and flies out and causes fires. Well, anyway, the tungsten rod itself survives and hits the earth, and there's enough kinetic energy in that tungsten rod to be I think it was like a half a kiloton or a kiloton worth of destructive force in this tungsten rod, right? Now I believe that because people believe they found the crater of where next to this ancient city where this weapon was used, but there's no radioactivity. For a long time they said, well, there is. But it turns out that when they actually studied it, that the radioactivity is the same amount of radioactivity that's around the whole area. So that it's not any more. There should be more, and there's not. So I think it was actually a kinetic energy weapon that was fired from orbit, and I think it was fired by the Black Knight. But the point of this is that happened 15,000 years ago. If the Mahabharata is to be believed. So if that happened 15,000 years ago, that means that 15,000 years ago, when supposedly we were painting pictures of deer and LaCroix, and we were Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, that at the same time over in India they had a technologically advanced civilization that could field a kinetic energy weapon, and they had airplanes that could shoot lasers at each other.
Oh, right? I wouldn't do that.
There's a disconnect there.
I said I wouldn't doubt that one at all.
No. In India, I know a guy, he's Indian, and, I've talked to him quite a number of times about it. And he says, in India, it's accepted, that they don't argue with it at all. They take it as fact. We try to overthink it, but in India, they're like, oh, the Mahabharata, yeah, it's a history book.
Yeah, that's the things that we need to really think about. I'm going to change it a little bit of something. When I was around 16, 17 years old, my father served with James Gardner, the actor, in Korea. And, he's the guy who did Rockford Files and all them type of shows. He used to come to our, every summer he would come up and spend the weekend with my father or a week or whatever. All growing up. And I got to, at the start, I didn't know who he was. And then when I got older, I realized, hey, that's the guy that played Maverick on TV and all that stuff.
Right.
Well, he was good friends with the president, Reagan. And I said, I really would like to talk to Reagan. And Reagan at that time used to have a monthly show where he would talk to young people, would call in and ask the president questions.
Oh, right.
Well, I didn't call the president. The president called me, thanks to my dad's friend. And I was on the air with talking to the president maybe for 5-10 minutes and just talking about stuff. Well, evidently I must have, at 16, 17 years old, impressed the president enough where he called me several times and gave me a special number where I could call him. I don't care if the audience believe it or not. But I got to know a little bit about Reagan, and somehow, I don't know how it got up about, we were talking about Star Wars, and it was really funny. He said something, at that time, I didn't really think much of it. He was talking about, that the Earth needed Star Wars. And I remember saying, what, to protect us against, Russia, the Soviet Union? And he goes, no, them out there. And he stressed them out there numerous times in our phone conversation. I didn't think nothing of it, not to, recently when I started thinking about all the stuff that's transpiring, them out there is telling me it isn't, well, if it isn't Russia on our planet, then they must have been concerned even then about something out there maybe is a threat.
Right. Germans. Nazis.
Yeah, somebody. Or aliens.
Mine. Or aliens, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I remember I was on a radio show once. I think I told you this one too, but I always love this one. But I was on a radio show, and I'm not big on whistleblowers. I'm not really a whistleblower kind of guy. I do research and I find things that are publicly available, and that's how I do things. But I was on this radio show, and this always happens. We're talking about the secret space program, and I'm talking about, some of the Star Wars defense systems that they were building, Brilliant Pebbles, Project Thor, a lot of this stuff. And this guy calls in. I swear to God, it was like the last 5 minutes of the show. This guy calls in. He says, I'm a retired aerospace engineer for a big company from the Pacific Northwest. And he says, back in the early 70s, I worked at a top secret facility down in Southern California. And I'm like, okay. And he said, well, I worked on a program called Solar Warden. And I'm like, okay, because that's supposedly the whole secret space program thing, Gary McKinnon and all that. And he says that we worked on a three satellite constellation. There were two that were put into equatorial orbit, and they were killer satellites, meaning that they were satellites designed to shoot at stuff. They had lasers, and they were designed to shoot at targets, right? And he said that there was a third satellite, which was a hunter-killer, and what that meant is that satellite could actually move, right? So those first two were actually put in equatorial orbit, so they went around the equator of the Earth just continuously. But the third one, they could make it fly wherever they want until it ran out of power or whatever. And he said that he worked on it. He knows for a fact that it was launched and that it's up in space right now and it's still in use. And I'm like, okay. And I'm thinking to myself, I got 1,000 questions for this guy. And he says, okay, that's it. I hope you enjoyed my story. Click. And he hung up. But what that told me, because he was a very old man, you could tell. And, his voice was rickety and, he spoke like an older person. And he wasn't about telling you who he was. He didn't care if you believed him or not. He was simply going to tell you what he was going to tell you, and that was it. He was out. But what he told us was very interesting because it backed up what I've always believed, is that although the Star Wars defense system on paper was shit can, that in reality they actually got it up there into orbit. And the best example I can give you of trying to cover up something like that is something called the polyeskiff. The polyeskiff was this massive, it was the size of a space shuttle, massive defense satellite that was put into orbit by the Russians, by the Soviets. And they got it into orbit, and this thing had nuclear weapons on it, it had lasers, it had all kinds of stuff, right? It was basically like a one-stop Star Wars shop. It pretty much had everything that the Star Wars program could field, but from the Soviet Union. So they got this thing up in orbit. At the ground station, one of the technicians sent a command up to this thing, and the command was to unfurl the solar panels. So the solar panels unfurl, okay, and everything's going great. And then they claimed that he went to send a second command to move it into a predetermined orbit, right? But when he sent the command to unfoil the solar panels again, because, we're all human, right? So he sends the command again. He duplicated the command, okay?
Uh-huh.
When he duplicated the command, the onboard computer freaked out and fired the engines and put it into a ballistic orbit. So what that means is that it fired the engines and put it into a orbit that would eventually cause it to burn up.